Look at any crowd photo from the early 1950s, a packed baseball stadium on a summer afternoon, an American factory floor during the morning shift, a small-town church picnic. The men are thin, not fitness model thin, not dieting thin, just ordinary thin. Flat stomachs, tucked-in shirts, belts that actually sit at the waist. But walk through any grocery store parking lot in America today, and that silhouette is gone. The round, protruding midsection is everywhere. So what happened? How did an entire country go from lean waistlines to a 40% obesity rate in barely 2 generations? The numbers alone tell a staggering story. By the end of the 1950s, government health researchers measured the average American man at 166 pounds. A few decades later, that number on the bathroom scale had climbed to 191 pounds. Today, it sits closer to 198. That's a 32-pound increase on a frame that only grew about 1 inch taller over the same period, the equivalent of strapping a full cinder block to the average American man's midsection. And the women's numbers are equally striking. The average American woman now weighs approximately what the average man weighed back then. Both sexes have drifted from the lower end of a normal body mass index into the overweight range, and for many, well past it. At mid-century, the obesity rate among men hovered around 6%. Today, roughly 4 in 10 American adults qualify as obese, and nearly 1 in 10 falls into the severely obese category. That's not a gradual drift. That's a transformation. How does someone go from 166 pounds to 198 without getting any taller? The answer isn't one thing. It's a dozen things layered on top of each other across 70 years of American life, each one small enough to ignore in the moment and devastating in the aggregate. Start with something that nobody back then would have called exercise. Movement. The average American man in that era didn't go to a gym. Nobody owned a stationary bike in the garage or tracked steps on a wristwatch. Instead, a man walked to the bus stop, through the factory, to the hardware store on Saturday morning. His wife, if she stayed home, spent her day on her feet, scrubbing floors by hand, hanging laundry on a clothesline, kneading bread dough on the kitchen counter. The physical demands of ordinary life burned calories that nobody counted because nobody needed to count them. Movement was woven into the structure of the day, not bolted on as an afterthought. A British heart disease researcher was among the first to notice this connection. In the early 1950s, he began studying bus workers in London and discovered that the conductors who climbed stairs all day collecting fares on double-decker buses had significantly lower rates of heart disease than the drivers who sat behind the wheel for their entire shift. That study became one of the earliest scientific observations that daily physical activity protected the heart. And the key insight was that the conductors were not athletes. They were just doing their job. The movement was built into the work itself. But what researchers found on those London buses was only the beginning of the picture. That is the detail that matters most. Post-war America did not produce lean physiques because people were disciplined about fitness. It produced lean physiques because the architecture of daily life demanded constant low-grade physical effort, hanging laundry on a backyard clothesline and mowing the lawn with a push-reel mower, walking to the post office and carrying groceries home in paper bags. None of it was strenuous enough to call exercise. All of it added up to something that a treadmill in a basement struggles to replicate. Consider what replaced it. By the 1980s, millions of Americans spent their working hours seated in office chairs, staring at computer monitors, driving to work in air-conditioned cars, and returning home to sit in front of television sets for 3 or 4 hours each evening. The average American adult today spends more than 6 hours per day sitting. That is not a small behavioral change. That is a fundamental redesign of the human day, one that removes the very calorie-burning activity that earlier generations performed without a second thought. But movement was only half the equation. The other half was food, not the quality of the food, which is a more complicated conversation, the quantity. Back then, the American food supply provided roughly 800 fewer calories per person per day than it does today. That's not a small difference. That is an entire extra meal's worth of available energy every single day for every person in the country. Where did those calories come from? Mostly from three categories that barely existed at mid-century: added fats and cooking oils, refined grain products like packaged pastries and fast food buns, and caloric sweeteners, particularly corn syrup. Corn syrup changed the American food landscape in ways that are still playing out. The sweetener was first developed in a research laboratory in the late 1950s, but it did not reach grocery store shelves in large quantities until 2 decades later, when sugar shortages and government corn subsidies made it far cheaper than cane sugar. Within a generation, corn syrup accounted for over 40% of all sweeteners used in the country. Over the following decades, the average American's daily fructose intake climbed from 37 grams to nearly 55 grams, and teenagers consumed even more, averaging over 70 grams per day. The sweetener found its way into soft drink bottles, loaves of bread, cereal boxes, ketchup, salad dressing, and dozens of other grocery store products that had never contained it before. But the sugar story is only part of a larger pattern. Over the second half of the 20th century, total sweetener consumption in America rose by 43 pounds per person per year. That's not a metaphor. That is 43 additional pounds of sugar and corn syrup being consumed annually by each American, compared to what their grandparents ate at mid-century. And pay attention to this next detail, because it explains a lot about how the change crept in without anyone noticing. Now here is the detail that even people who follow nutrition closely tend to miss. It wasn't only that Americans started eating sweeter food. They started eating more of everything, and they started eating it away from home. At mid-century, only 25 cents of every food dollar went to restaurants and takeout. Today, that figure has crossed 50 cents. More than half of the average food budget goes to meals prepared by someone else in portions that the customer does not control. Fast food portions alone have more than doubled over the past 70 years. A standard hamburger at a diner back then weighed less than half of what a modern fast food burger weighs today. French fries came in a single small size, and a fountain soda was 6 or 8 ounces, roughly a third of what a medium cup holds now. The grain numbers are revealing, too. Per capita flour and cereal consumption reached 200 pounds per year by the turn of the century, up from 155 pounds a generation earlier. Americans were eating more bread, more pasta, more pizza dough, more packaged bakery snacks from the grocery store aisle, and the grain they consumed was overwhelmingly refined, stripped of fiber and nutrients, converted quickly into blood sugar after every meal. Meanwhile, cheese consumption quadrupled. Milk consumption dropped by nearly 40%. What went on to the average American dinner plate had fundamentally shifted, and most people had no idea it was happening because each change arrived slowly, one product at a time, one restaurant visit at a time, one slightly larger serving at a time. But calories and portion sizes are only part of why bellies grew. What people stopped doing between meals mattered nearly as much as what they started eating during them. And this brings up something that doesn't show up in nutrition data, but matters enormously: mealtime structure. Back then, most American families ate dinner together at a kitchen table at roughly the same time each evening. Breakfast was eaten at home. Lunch was packed in a brown bag, a sandwich, a piece of fruit, maybe a small side. Snacking between meals was uncommon, not because people had more willpower, but because the snack infrastructure didn't exist yet. There were no vending machines in every hallway, no gas station convenience stores stocked with candy and energy drinks, no drive-through windows open until midnight. The opportunities to eat outside of mealtimes were fewer, and that structural limitation did more for waistlines than any diet plan ever could. If you are finding value in this, take a second and subscribe. I cover health history like this regularly, and there is a lot more to unpack. So we have less movement and more food. Those two forces alone would explain a significant portion of the weight gain. But here is the part of the story that still surprises most people. There is a third factor that researchers have only recently begun to understand, and it connects directly to the specific kind of weight gain we are talking about. Not weight distributed evenly across the body, but weight concentrated in the abdomen, the protruding belly, the visceral fat. Why does the weight seem to go straight to the midsection? Visceral fat is different from the fat directly beneath your skin. It wraps around your internal organs, your liver, your intestines, your kidneys, and is metabolically active in ways that subcutaneous fat is not. This deep abdominal fat releases inflammatory compounds and disrupts insulin signaling, and it is strongly correlated with one hormone in particular, cortisol, the stress hormone. When the body experiences chronic stress, whether from financial pressure, sleep deprivation, overwork, or the low-grade anxiety of being constantly connected to a screen, cortisol levels remain elevated for extended periods. And elevated cortisol does something very specific. It tells the body to store fat around the midsection. Belly fat tissue has a higher concentration of cortisol receptors than fat tissue anywhere else on the body. So when cortisol stays high, the belly is where the fat goes first. Chronic stress also breaks down muscle tissue, which lowers your metabolic rate, which makes future fat storage even easier. It's a cycle that feeds itself, and it helps explain why belly fat is so stubborn once it arrives. Now, were people in earlier decades stress-free? Of course not. The Cold War kept families building fallout shelters in their backyards, and racial injustice was systemic and brutal. Plenty of families struggled with poverty, illness, and loss. But the texture of daily stress was different. There were no smartphones delivering bad news every 90 seconds. There was no algorithmic feed designed to keep you anxious and scrolling at 1 in the morning. Evenings were quieter. When the sun went down, entertainment options narrowed to a few television channels, a book, or conversation. People went to bed earlier and slept more. And that matters because sleep deprivation is one of the strongest triggers for elevated cortisol. Even a single night of poor sleep raises next-day cortisol levels and increases hunger hormones. Chronic sleep restriction compounds the effect, creating a state where cortisol remains elevated through the day and never follows its normal rhythm. Meanwhile, the physical activity woven into daily life, the walking, the manual housework, the yard work, acted as a natural cortisol buffer. Regular movement helps regulate the body's stress response system. Sedentary individuals tend to carry higher baseline cortisol levels and respond to stress with a more exaggerated hormonal spike. In other words, the less you move, the more stress hits your belly. This is the part of the story that is easy to oversimplify. It would be convenient to say that earlier generations had it all figured out and that we should go back to the way things were, but that is not what the evidence shows. The post-war American diet was heavy on red meat, saturated fat, and butter. Vegetables were often boiled until they lost most of their nutritional value. Bacon grease sat in a tin on the stove and was used to season nearly everything. Smoking was rampant, and while nicotine does suppress appetite, the health consequences of cigarettes make it a catastrophic trade. Dangerous diet fads existed then too. Over-the-counter diet pills were sold at every drugstore counter. Women used vibrating belt machines that promised effortless slimming, and the nutritional science of the era was crude by modern standards, with dietary guidelines that included a recommendation of 2 or more tablespoons of butter per day. That era was not a golden age of health. It was a time when certain structural conditions, smaller portions, constant low-level movement, limited access to processed food, fewer opportunities to snack, happened to keep waistlines in check, without anyone planning it that way. The transformation did not happen overnight. The adult obesity rate increased by over 200% across the second half of the 20th century, but the change wasn't steady, it accelerated. In the decades right after the war, the increase was gradual, almost imperceptible from one year to the next. The average American was adding weight so slowly that yearly checkups at the doctor's office barely registered the change. Then came the 1980s, and the curve bent sharply upward. Fast food chains expanded aggressively into every suburb and small town in the country. Portion sizes ballooned at restaurants from diners to drive-thrus. Corn syrup saturated the grocery store food supply, showing up in products where no one expected to find sweetener. And desk-based office work replaced manual labor for a growing share of the workforce. By the turn of the century, Americans consumed 57 more pounds of meat per year compared to their grandparents, ate 4 times as much cheese, used 200 pounds of flour and cereal products per person compared to 155 pounds a generation earlier, and washed it all down with over 20% more added sweeteners. Each individual shift was small enough to ignore. Together, they redrew the silhouette of the average American body. And the part that makes this story difficult to untangle is that nobody orchestrated it. Nobody sat in a boardroom and decided to make Americans heavier. It happened one convenience at a time. The real question is not why your grandfather didn't have a belly. What matters is what we lost without noticing. Not a diet, not a fitness regimen, a way of life that made leanness a byproduct rather than a goal. Walks that were not optional, meals that were not supersized, evenings that were not spent sitting in front of a glowing screen with a bag of chips engineered to be impossible to put down. None of those things disappeared because someone made a bad decision. They disappeared quietly because 1,000 small conveniences, each one useful on its own, removed the friction that had been keeping us in balance all along. And maybe the most honest takeaway is this: those men in old photographs weren't doing anything heroic. They were just living in a world that hadn't yet made it so easy to gain weight without even trying. That world changed around them. Their grandchildren inherited the consequences.